March 24, 1944. Stalag Luft III, Nazi Germany. 22:30 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Bob Neumann pressed his ear against the wooden wall of Hut 104, listening to the rhythm of German guard boots on frozen earth. The sound was hypnotic, predictable, 18 seconds between passes, consistent as a metronome for the past 6 months. Beside him, Captain James Jimmy Doyle was covered in dirt, having just emerged from a hole barely wider than a man's shoulders, located beneath a coal stove that had been carefully engineered to swing aside on hidden hinges. They'd been digging for 11 months, 336 days of moving dirt one handful at a time, breathing stale air in a tunnel 30 feet underground, gambling their lives on a plan that every rational analysis said was impossible. The German commandant, Oberst von Lindeiner, had told them during inspection, "Gentlemen, you are in the most escape-proof camp in the Reich. The wire is too high, the seismographs too sensitive, the guards too vigilant. Tunnel if you wish, we will find you." He'd said it with Prussian certainty, absolute confidence in German engineering over American improvisation. That certainty was about to be tested, because tonight, 76 men would attempt to crawl through 336 feet of tunnel toward a forest that represented the thin line between captivity and freedom. Context: Stalag Luft III and the culture of escape. Stalag Luft III was the Luftwaffe's premier camp for Allied Air Force officers, located deep in German territory, specifically to make escape difficult. By 1943, it held over 10,000 prisoners, British, American, Canadian, and other Allied airmen, shot down over occupied Europe. The camp was designed with escape prevention as its primary architectural principle. Barracks raised on stilts so guards could see beneath them, warning wire 20 feet inside the main fence, seismograph sensors to detect tunneling, regular ground inspections, and a guard-to-prisoner ratio higher than most facilities. The Geneva Conventions granted officer POWs certain privileges. They couldn't be forced to work. They received adequate rations, supplemented by Red Cross parcels, and they were entitled to recreational activities. What the conventions didn't anticipate was how these privileges would be weaponized. Allied prisoners, particularly the RAF officers in the North Compound, had developed escape attempts into an almost industrial operation, not because they expected most escapes to succeed, but because escape operations tied up German resources, disrupted camp routine, and maintained prisoner morale through purposeful resistance. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Neumann arrived at Stalag Luft III in April 1943 after his B-17 was shot down over Bremen. He was 32 years old, an engineer from Chicago who'd worked on subway construction before the war. The Germans saw an officer. His fellow prisoners saw something more valuable, someone who understood soil mechanics, structural integrity, and the mathematics of underground construction. Within weeks of arrival, Neumann was recruited into the Escape Committee, the X organization, led by RAF squadron leader Roger Bushell. The American section of Stalag Luft III in the South Compound operated semi-independently from the British prisoners. There was cooperation, but also competition, a friendly rivalry about who could pull off the most audacious escape. The British were planning Harry, an ambitious tunnel from Hut 104 in the North Compound. The Americans, initially skeptical about joining what seemed like a British operation, eventually contributed men, materials, and most critically, engineering expertise. Neumann brought Captain Jimmy Doyle into the project, a former mining engineer from Pennsylvania, who'd flown P-47s before being shot down. Together, they represented American pragmatism joining British determination, the perfect combination for an escape attempt that would require both meticulous planning and desperate improvisation. Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindeiner Wildau was not a stereotypical Nazi. He was a career Luftwaffe officer, 55 years old, who ran Stalag Luft III with strict adherence to Geneva Convention rules. He respected his prisoners as fellow aviators, ensured adequate treatment, and even arranged musical instruments and theatrical supplies. But he was also absolutely convinced that escape from his camp was impossible. He'd studied every previous attempt, installed countermeasures, and created what he believed was a perfect system. His confidence rested on German engineering, seismographs that could detect digging, sand dispersal that would be obvious against the gray surface soil, informant networks among prisoners, or so he believed, and the simple geographic reality that successful escapees would need to travel hundreds of miles through hostile territory to reach neutral countries. Von Lindiner gave regular lectures to new prisoners. "Gentlemen, I understand your duty to attempt escape. It is my duty to prevent it. My duty is easier because physics and geography are on my side." The prisoners smiled politely and continued planning. What von Lindiner underestimated wasn't Allied courage. He respected that, but Allied creativity under constraint. The prisoners had nothing but time and desperation, which paradoxically made them better engineers than their captors. Every problem the Germans thought insurmountable became a puzzle to solve. The Tunnel Harry represented the culmination of lessons learned from dozens of failed attempts. It would be deeper than seismographs could detect, 30 feet down. It would be longer than any previous tunnel, over 300 feet. It would have electric lighting, stolen wire, air pumps, improvised from kit bags and tin cans, and even a trolley system, built from bed slats and metal fittings. The Germans believed such a tunnel was theoretically possible, but practically impossible given the resources available to prisoners. They were wrong. The prisoners had one resource the Germans consistently underestimated: collective intelligence organized through military discipline. Every man in the X organization had a role: diggers, sand dispersers, lookouts, forgers, tailors, metalworkers, intelligence gatherers. It was an underground factory masquerading as a bored prisoner population. Neumann, observing German guard patterns, calculated, "They're confident because they think like Germans, systematic, rule-bound, predictable. They assume we'll think the same way. Our advantage is we're willing to attempt things that seem crazy because crazy is just innovative before it succeeds." 2 weeks into digging, the Americans discovered the fatal flaw in their plan. Neumann and Doyle were in the tunnel when they hit it. Bright yellow sand, completely different from the gray topsoil covering the camp. The difference was startling. Gray sand could be dispersed inconspicuously in exercise yards and gardens. Yellow sand would stand out like a beacon, immediately alerting guards to tunneling activity. They called an emergency X organization meeting. Squadron leader Bushel, the overall escape coordinator, assessed the situation grimly. "We have two options. Abandon the tunnel or solve the sand problem. I'm not abandoning 11 months of work." Neumann proposed an engineering solution that sounded insane. "We go deeper. Below the yellow layer, there should be gray sand again. We're currently at 23 feet. If we go to 30 feet, we might break through to older deposits that match the surface." "That's another 7 feet of digging," someone objected. "Through clay. It'll take months and increase collapse risk." "Yes," Neumann agreed, "but it's possible, and possible means we do it." The decision was made. They'd go deeper, much deeper than any previous tunnel, deeper than the seismographs could reliably detect, into ground so compressed it required pickaxes made from metal bed frames. The work became exponentially harder. Men worked in shifts, lying on their stomachs in darkness, chipping away at clay inches at a time. The air was so bad that diggers could only work 15-minute shifts before being dragged out, gasping and sometimes unconscious. Doyle nearly died during this phase. He was digging when the clay face collapsed partially, pinning his legs and cutting off the air pipe. The men behind him heard nothing. Sound didn't travel well in the tunnel. Only when his replacement shift found him motionless did they realize what had happened. They dragged him out, performed improvised CPR, and miraculously revived him. Doyle was back in the tunnel 3 days later, insisting, "I didn't almost die just to quit now." The depth problem was eventually solved. They broke through to gray sand at 32 feet. But the near-death experience crystallized something. They weren't playing a game anymore. This was life-or-death engineering, where mistakes meant suffocation or capture. And they were committed beyond any rational point of return, living a double life, appearing to be idle prisoners while operating an underground factory, took immense psychological discipline. The X organization developed elaborate security protocols. Lookouts called stooges monitored German movements constantly. A signal system warned of approaching guards. Subtle gestures, whistled tunes, objects placed in specific locations. Every prisoner involved had to maintain perfect normalcy, while carrying the secret that beneath their feet lay a tunnel complex that would have impressed professional mining companies. Neumann found the deception exhausting in ways combat had never been. In a bomber over Germany, danger was acute but temporary. Minutes of terror followed by hours of relief. Here, danger was chronic and constant. Every German inspection could reveal the tunnel. Every casual conversation with guards required careful lies. Every sound in the night made him wonder if they'd been discovered. The American prisoners developed different coping mechanisms. Some threw themselves into the work obsessively, finding purpose in the escape that justified their captivity. Others maintained deliberate psychological distance, participating but not emotionally investing in success. A few cracked under the strain, developing psychosomatic illnesses, paranoia about informants, or debilitating anxiety that made them security risks. The X organization had to remove several men from the project, not for disloyalty, but for psychological instability. One officer, after 8 months of work, became convinced the Germans knew everything and were deliberately letting them dig to identify all conspirators. His paranoia became contagious, requiring his forcible exclusion. It was a reminder. Sustained covert operations require specific psychological resilience that not everyone possesses. The Germans noticed behavioral changes but misinterpreted them. Von Lindiner observed in a report, "American prisoners showing increased lethargy and disinterest appears to be natural adjustment to captivity rather than suspicious activity." He mistook exhaustion from underground labor for acceptance of imprisonment, exactly the misdirection the prisoners needed. Neumann kept a secret diary, hidden inside a hollowed-out book. His entries revealed the psychological warfare. Day 237. K almost gave us away by jumping when guard approached during dispersal. Must talk to him. Day 251. Dreamed I was in the tunnel and it collapsed. Woke up unable to breathe. Day 289. Starting to believe we might actually succeed. More frightening than thinking we'd fail. Success means leaving this hell, but also means dozens of men crawling through death trap I helped build. The weight of responsibility was crushing. Every decision, tunnel depth, air system design, shore quality, could mean life or death for 76 men. While Neumann and Doyle engineered the tunnel, other prisoners created the infrastructure necessary for escape to matter. Getting out of the camp was only step one. Surviving in Nazi Germany required documents, clothing, money, and intelligence. The X organization's support network was as impressive as the tunnel itself. Flight Lieutenant Tim Whalen ran the forgery department, a former advertising designer who became the camp's master counterfeiter, working with stolen pens, improvised inks made from crushed pencils and boot polish, and paper carefully extracted from Red Cross parcels and camp documents. He produced German passes, travel permits, and identification papers of remarkable quality. His team worked in hidden workshops, with lookouts posted to give warning if guards approached. American Captain Tex Harrison led the tailoring section. Prisoners donated or traded for clothing that could be altered to resemble civilian suits. German greatcoats were carefully stolen from laundry facilities and modified. RAF uniforms were dyed with potassium permanganate obtained from the camp hospital. The results wouldn't fool close inspection but might pass cursory examination on a train or at a checkpoint. The mapmakers traced and reproduced German railway maps, hiking maps, and regional geography from memory, library books, and scraps of German newspapers. Neumann contributed technical drafting skills, creating compass roses and scale indicators with geometric precision. These maps, drawn on tissue paper that could be hidden in clothing seams, were potentially life-saving navigation tools. Most critically, the intelligence network gathered information about the world outside. Prisoners bribed guards with cigarettes from Red Cross parcels to obtain newspapers. They decoded BBC broadcasts on a radio hidden in a false-bottomed can. They pumped guards for casual information about train schedules, checkpoint procedures, and local geography. This intelligence was compiled into escape kits for each prisoner, forged papers appropriate to their cover identity, maps, some German currency, real bills carefully stolen or traded for, concentrated food, and specific instructions. Neumann received his escape kit in February 1944, papers identifying him as a French electrical worker traveling to a job in Hamburg, a map highlighting railway routes to neutral Sweden, 50 Reichsmarks, and a compass made from a magnetized razor blade suspended on a thread. The sophistication was remarkable. The X organization had created an escape agency that would have impressed professional intelligence services, all using stolen materials and improvised tools. March 1944. The tunnel was complete, 336 feet from entrance to exit, but there was a cruel mathematical reality. 76 spaces for over 600 men who'd contributed to the project. The selection process was agonizing. The escape committee established criteria: language skills, German speakers prioritized, previous escape experience, physical fitness, and contribution to the project. Beyond that, lottery. Neumann was guaranteed a spot. His engineering had been essential. But many men who'd worked as hard or harder were excluded by random draw. The emotional aftermath was brutal. Men who'd spent months dispersing sand, standing watch, or carving tunnel supports learned they wouldn't go. Some accepted it stoically. Others broke down. One officer confronted Neumann. "I carried sand for 8 months. 8 months? And some guy who joined the project last month gets to go because he drew a lower number?" Neumann had no good answer. "It's not fair. Nothing about this is fair. We're in a prison camp because war isn't fair. I'm sorry." The night before the escape, the 76 selected men gathered for a final briefing. Bushell, who would lead the escape, spoke with the kind of intensity that comes from knowing lives depend on words. "Tomorrow night we crawl through a tunnel we built with stolen tools and desperate hope. Most of us won't make it to freedom. Statistically, maybe 5 will reach neutral territory. The rest will be recaptured or killed. I can't promise success, I can only promise we tried." The Americans held their own smaller meeting afterward. Neumann addressed his countrymen. "We're going last, after the British and Canadians. We're the emergency reserve if something goes wrong. We might not even get into the tunnel if there's a problem. But if we do, remember, the tunnel is survival. But Germany is the real test. Don't get cocky if you make it out. 100 miles of Nazi territory stand between us and freedom." That night, Neumann wrote a final diary entry. "Tomorrow we discover if 11 months of work results in freedom or execution. I'm not scared of failing. I'm scared of succeeding and getting the men behind me killed because I miscalculated something. Leadership means carrying responsibility for deaths you might cause. Combat command was easier. The enemy killed your men. Here, my mistakes kill them." He hid the diary and tried to sleep. Sleep didn't come. March 24, 1944, 21 hours. The escape began in darkness and immediate complications. The first man through, RAF officer Johnny Bull, emerged from the tunnel exit to discover a catastrophic error. The tunnel was 15 feet short of the forest. Instead of exiting safely in woods beyond the tree line, the exit was in open ground visible from guard towers. One engineering miscalculation, possibly from compressed measurements or undetected tunnel subsidence, had turned a carefully planned escape into a desperate gamble. Bull made a snap decision. They'd continue anyway, but men would exit individually when guards weren't looking, then crawl to the forest. A rope system was rigged. 1 tug meant safe to exit. 2 tugs meant guards approaching. The process that should have taken minutes per man would now take 10 or 15. The 76-man timeline was already impossible. Inside the tunnel, Neumann and the other Americans waited in the staging hut, knowing nothing about the problem. Men disappeared into the tunnel entrance every 15 minutes, vanishing beneath the stove. The operation was mechanical. Strip to underwear, put clothes in waterproof bag, crawl 336 feet in near total darkness, emerge, dress, run. Simple in theory, terrifying in practice. At 23:30, a tunnel collapse blocked progress for nearly an hour. Diggers had to shore up the collapse while men behind them waited in darkness, breathing stale air, fighting claustrophobia. When progress resumed, they'd lost 12 spaces on the timeline. At 01 hour, an air raid siren sent guards scrambling and shut off camp electricity. The tunnel's electrical lighting died, leaving men crawling in absolute darkness. Some panicked. Others talked them through it, voices echoing weirdly in the confined space. "Keep moving, follow the trolley rope, count the shoring frames. You're fine." By 03 Vrau, only 37 men had exited, half the target. Neumann was number 63, still in the staging hut, increasingly certain he wouldn't get a chance to enter. The Americans were the last group. If time ran out, they'd be left behind while British and Canadian prisoners escaped. Then at 04:45, 90 minutes before dawn roll call, disaster. A German guard on routine patrol spotted movement near the tunnel exit. He fired a warning shot and raised the alarm. Within minutes, searchlights blazed. Machine guns trained on the forest. Sirens wailed. The escape was over. Only 76 men hadn't made it out. Only 73 had. Neumann was still in Hut 104 when guards burst in with rifles leveled. He considered destroying evidence but realized it was pointless. The tunnel was discovered, the entrance obvious. Surrender was the only option. He and the other Americans waiting for their turn were marched to the camp jail, joining the handful of escapees who'd been caught before even entering the tunnel. Over the following 3 weeks, the Gestapo and Wehrmacht launched the largest manhunt in German history. 73 Allied officers were loose in Nazi territory with forged papers, stolen clothing, and desperate determination. Some headed for ports, hoping to stow away on neutral ships. Others aimed for Switzerland or Sweden. A few attempted to reach Czechoslovakia, where resistance movements might help them. The recaptures came in waves. Some men were caught at train stations when their papers failed inspection. Others were found hiking through forests by Home Guard patrols. A few made it hundreds of miles before being identified. Only 3, 2 Norwegians and a Dutchman, successfully reached neutral territory. The rest were captured within days or weeks. Then came the executions. On Hitler's direct order, 50 recaptured officers were murdered by the Gestapo, not returned to camp, not court-martialed, simply taken to remote locations and shot. The official story was, shot while trying to escape, but everyone knew it was execution. The Nazis were sending a message. Escape attempts would result not in punishment but in death. Among the 50 murdered were men Neumann knew intimately, officers who dug beside him, dispersed sand with him, shared jokes and fears. Squadron leader Roger Bushell, the mastermind, was executed. Tim Wallen, the forger, was executed. Of the American prisoners who'd escaped, several were among the 50 killed. When the survivors learned the names of the dead, the camp fell into shocked silence. Von Lindeiner, the camp commandant, was horrified. He'd run a Geneva Convention-compliant camp, and now his prisoners had been murdered on Hitler's orders. He protested to Berlin and was subsequently removed from command and court-martialed for being too lenient. Neumann, sitting in the camp jail awaiting his own fate, wrote a clandestine message smuggled through prisoner networks. They killed men for trying to be free. They turned a military escape into mass murder. We failed to get away, but we succeeded in revealing what kind of enemy we face. April 1944. The surviving prisoners were returned to Stalag Luft III, but the camp had changed. The murders had transformed the dynamic between captors and captives. German guards who'd maintained professional relationships with prisoners now faced cold hostility. The prisoners understood. They were no longer dealing with honorable military opponents, but with a regime capable of murdering POWs. The X-organization was formally disbanded by prisoner leadership, not from fear but from practicality. The murders had made escape attempts too costly. Any future escapee faced not recapture, but execution. The risk-reward calculation had fundamentally changed. But disbandment didn't mean surrender. The prisoners redirected their energy into documentation, recording everything about the escape, the tunnel, and especially the murders, for future war crimes prosecution. Neumann became part of this documentation effort. He drew technical diagrams of the tunnel system, wrote detailed accounts of the engineering challenges, and compiled testimonies from survivors about what they'd seen and heard. This material was hidden throughout the camp in multiple copies, ensuring it would survive even if Germans discovered some caches. The psychological impact on prisoners was complex. Some felt the escape had been a tragic waste, 50 men dead for nothing. Others argued it had succeeded strategically. The tunnel had tied up thousands of German troops in the manhunt. The murders had revealed Nazi brutality to the world through neutral country intelligence channels, and the prisoners had demonstrated that even in captivity, resistance continued. Neumann wrote to his wife through censored mail, unable to mention the escape directly. We attempted something difficult recently. It didn't work out as we hoped. Friends were lost. But I learned that trying matters even when success is impossible. We're still soldiers, even behind wire. That means something. He received a response months later. Your letter sounded different, sadder. Whatever you attempted, whatever you lost, please remember you're still alive. That's what matters to me. Come home. The simplicity of her request, just survive, just come home, highlighted the gulf between civilian and military thinking. For her, his survival was the only important thing. For him, survival without resistance felt like a different kind of death. The tension between those perspectives would define his remaining captivity and his post-war life. May 1945. The war ended. Stalag Luft III. Prisoners were liberated by Soviet forces advancing from the east. Neumann weighed 142 pounds. 50 pounds less than his capture weight. He was repatriated through Soviet and Allied lines, processed through military hospitals, and eventually returned to the United States in July 1945. He expected to return to normal life. Instead, he was immediately contacted by Army intelligence. They were building war crimes cases against Gestapo officers responsible for the murders. Would he testify? Neumann agreed without hesitation. October 1945, Nuremberg. Neumann sat in a military tribunal, facing German officers accused of the Great Escape murders. The lead defendant was General Nebe of the Gestapo, who'd coordinated the execution orders. Defense lawyers argued the shootings were legitimate under military law. Escaped prisoners shot while resisting recapture. Neumann's testimony was technical and devastating. He explained the tunnel engineering, the organizational sophistication, the meticulous planning. Then he addressed the murders. These were not combat casualties. These were military officers who'd surrendered upon recapture, who were then transported to remote locations and executed with single shots to the head. That's not combat. That's murder. The defense cross-examined aggressively. You admit you were escaping in violation of your parole? We were POWs. We had no parole. We had a military duty to escape if possible. Your escape tied up German military resources needed to fight the war. Wasn't it legitimate to respond harshly? Neumann looked directly at the defendant. If tying up military resources is a capital crime, then every German officer who made the Allies expend ammunition should be executed. That's absurd. The Geneva Conventions are clear. Escape attempts by POWs are not capital crimes. You murdered 50 men to terrorize the rest of us into compliance. You're not soldiers. You're thugs in uniforms. The tribunal ultimately convicted 18 defendants of war crimes related to the Great Escape murders. 13 were sentenced to death. The verdicts didn't bring back the 50 murdered men, but they established precedent. Murdering POWs was a war crime, regardless of the justification offered. Neumann watched the sentencing with grim satisfaction. Justice was imperfect and incomplete. Many perpetrators escaped prosecution, but 50 murders had been acknowledged, and some perpetrators faced consequences. It was the best outcome in an imperfect world. December 1945. Neumann was discharged from the Army with the rank of lieutenant colonel, a Bronze Star, and psychological damage he didn't yet have words for. What would later be recognized as PTSD manifested as nightmares. Always the same dream. He was in the tunnel, dirt collapsing, unable to breathe, knowing men behind him were dying because of his engineering miscalculation. He returned to Chicago, to his wife and the 2 children he'd barely known before the war. He resumed work as a civil engineer. On paper, he'd successfully reintegrated. In reality, he was performing normalcy while wrestling with survivor's guilt and moral complexity. A journalist interviewed him in 1946 for an article about the Great Escape. "Do you think it was worth it?" the journalist asked. 50 men died. Only 3 made it to freedom. Was the tunnel worth that cost? Neumann had been asked this question dozens of times and struggled with it constantly. His answer had evolved. Worth it to whom? To the 50 who died? Probably not. They'd rather be alive. To the 3 who made it? Absolutely. To the rest of us who survived captivity? I think yes. Here's why. We were prisoners, but we refused to be passive. We maintained discipline, organization, and purpose. We tied up German resources. We demonstrated that even behind wire, Allied officers remained dangerous, and we forced the Nazis to reveal their true nature by murdering POWs. Strategically, morally, psychologically, the escape succeeded even though most escapees didn't. Even though 50 men died? Even though, Neumann said quietly. I knew most of those men. I grieved them, but they volunteered knowing the risks. They chose to try. In war, we don't get to choose between good options and bad options. We choose between bad options and worse options. Passive captivity was worse than risky escape. The men who died understood that. The journalist pressed, Do you wish you'd designed the tunnel differently? Made it reach the forest? Every day, Neumann admitted. That 15-foot miscalculation haunts me. But I did the best engineering possible with the information and tools available. Perfection wasn't achievable. Good enough was all we had. And good enough freed 73 men, even if only briefly. In an imperfect world, that has to be sufficient. He believed that intellectually. Emotionally, it would take decades to accept. March 24, 1974, 30 years after the Great Escape, Survivors gathered in London for a memorial service honoring the 50 murdered officers. Neumann attended, now 63 years old, retired, and carrying 3 decades of reflection on what the tunnel had meant. The memorial included speeches, testimony from survivors, and unveiling of a monument listing the murdered men's names. British officers spoke eloquently about courage and sacrifice. Canadian representatives emphasized their nation's losses, and Neumann, representing American participants, was asked to speak. He stood before the monument, reading names he'd known as living men, friends who'd laughed, complained, hoped, and died for trying to be free. His prepared remarks dissolved. Instead, he spoke from deep truth. 30 years ago, we dug a tunnel because we couldn't accept captivity passively. We failed. Most of us were recaptured. 50 were murdered. Only 3 reached freedom. By conventional measures, the Great Escape was a disaster. But I've spent 3 decades reconsidering what success means. The Nazis wanted us docile, compliant, psychologically defeated. We refused. We built something impossible with inadequate tools and desperate hope. We demonstrated that human ingenuity and collective determination can challenge any system of control. The tunnel itself was temporary, filled in by Germans within days. But what it represented was permanent. The 50 men who died didn't die uselessly. They died asserting the principle that freedom matters more than safety, that resistance matters even when it's costly, and that human dignity includes the right to risk everything for liberty. The Nazis murdered them because they understood how dangerous that principle is to tyranny. We didn't fail. We succeeded in the ways that matter most. We remained soldiers instead of becoming cattle. We maintained hope instead of surrendering to despair. We built instead of destroying. And we forced our enemy to reveal themselves as murderers, which contributed to their ultimate prosecution and defeat. The 3 men who made it to freedom weren't the only ones who escaped. Every man who worked on that tunnel who believed it was possible, who refused to accept captivity as permanent, they escaped psychologically even if their bodies remained imprisoned. That's the real victory. Not physical freedom, which is always contingent, but psychological freedom which no one can take unless we surrender it. The audience stood in silence. Then, slowly, they applauded, not for heroism, but for hard-won wisdom. Robert Neumann died in Chicago in 1992, at age 81. His obituary mentioned his military service, his engineering career, and his family. It briefly noted his participation in the famous Great Escape from Stalag Luft III, but didn't elaborate. Most people who knew him in civilian life had no idea what he'd done or witnessed. Among his papers, his children found the hidden diary he'd kept during captivity, plus decades of correspondence with other survivors. The letters formed a collective meditation on courage, failure, survival, and memory. Many survivors wrestled with the same questions Neumann had. Was it worth it? Should we have tried? Did the 50 die for nothing? The consensus that emerged over decades was nuanced. The Great Escape was simultaneously a tactical failure and strategic success, a tragedy that demonstrated something essential about human nature. The prisoners had attempted the impossible with inadequate resources and failed in the immediate goal, but they'd succeeded in maintaining dignity, demonstrating resistance, and creating a legend that inspired subsequent generations. The tunnel itself, all 336 feet of desperate engineering, was discovered and destroyed by Germans within days of the escape. Nothing physical remained. But the idea remained, and ideas are more durable than tunnels. Every subsequent prisoner who resisted captivity, every person who chose risky freedom over safe oppression, every individual who built something audacious despite inadequate resources, they were spiritual descendants of the Great Escape. In 1963, the famous film The Great Escape dramatized the story, taking significant liberties with facts but capturing the emotional truth that ordinary men, when trapped, can accomplish extraordinary things through collective effort and refusal to accept their circumstances. Neumann consulted on the film, though he disliked its Hollywood glamorization of what had been terrifying, dirty, desperate work. The tunnel was never about just escaping a prison camp, Neumann wrote in his final journal entry, weeks before his death. It was about refusing to let captivity define us. We dug toward freedom knowing most of us wouldn't make it, because trying mattered more than succeeding. That's the lesson I hope survives me. Audacious resistance to oppression is worth attempting even when success is unlikely. The alternative, passive acceptance, is a different kind of death. If this story makes you reflect on courage, ingenuity, and the human refusal to surrender hope even in darkness. Share it, because the world always needs people willing to dig tunnels toward impossible freedom, knowing the odds are against them but digging anyway. That's not foolishness, that's the essence of human dignity.